So what can you expect at your E2 visa interview? In this video, we're going to go through the questions you can anticipate and sort of how you have to prepare, what you have to do for your E2 visa interview. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming back to the channel. I'm attorney Adrian Pandev, and I try to help through these videos and in my practice to help foreigners navigate the U.S. government maze and visas, taxes, and U.S. investments, and basically helping foreigners navigate the U.S. Now, as I said, in this video, we're going to focus on the E2 treaty, investor visa, specifically the interview process and the questions and what you can anticipate at your E2 visa interview. So as background, right, the E2 visa interview is mandatory for anyone applying for a new E2 visa. So any investor applying for an E2 investor visa will have an E2 visa interview at a U.S. consulate. It's a requirement. Many people are afraid about this. I tell everyone that it's actually an awesome way for you to prove that your business, that your investment meets the requirements for an E2 visa, and you should view this interview as an opportunity to actually present your case to the officer. So rather than being, afraid of it, you should be excited about it, because it is generally the final step before your visa is issued, and it is a way for you to really demonstrate your case to the U.S. government. So let's talk first and foremost about the purpose of this E2 visa interview, right? Like, why is this interview even taking place, right? Well, the main purpose of the interview is to verify the information that you provided in your E2 visa application, right? The other purpose is just to make sure that the information that you provided is actually truthful, and that all the information, aligns with reality based on the documents, and that it wasn't just some, to put it bluntly, made up story that you provided in your application. And then in addition to that, the officers want to make sure that you qualify and you meet all the E2 visa criteria, right? And I've recorded separate videos going over the requirements for the E2 visa, so I don't want to go through them one by one here. But the bottom line is the officer will verify all information and ask you questions and try to ascertain whether or not you meet the criteria, the requirements for issuance of an E2 visa. So the first and foremost thing that you should do before your E2 visa interview is prepare, right? You should prepare documents, and we'll go over those in a second, and also prepare for the questions and prepare for the process so that you can go through this smoothly and that you're not super anxious on the day of the interview. And hopefully, with this video, I'll help you, gather some information that should help you, prepare and be ready for your E2 visa interview. So before you go any further, the first thing I would do is familiarize myself with the E2 visa requirements, right? And like I said, I've recorded other videos on that, but the bottom line is, right, you have to show that your company, the U.S. company, is at least 50% owned by a citizen of the treaty country, right? You have to show that you've made a substantial investment into this treaty enterprise, right, the E2 company, and you have to show that this investment is not marginal, basically that it will scale, that the company will scale to a point where it will provide for a living for more than just you and your family, but also others, predominantly U.S. workers, right? And to put it bluntly, basically that it's going to have a positive economic impact on the U.S., right? And then finally, with any E2 visa, you always have to at least state and demonstrate an intent that you will be leaving the U.S. after your E2 visa period, right? Basically the duration of your status or your E2 visa in the US. That is a requirement generally satisfied by just a simple statement. But you should understand these requirements because it will help you prepare the documents you're bringing, as well as prepare for the questions that you will be answering, because the officer will be trying to determine throughout this interview whether you meet these requirements, right? So first thing I tell everyone, understand the E2 visa requirements, right? That's a great place to start. Now, the second thing is prepare your documents. Before you even get to questions, what kind of questions you can anticipate, get all your documents ready, right? So these documents will entail financial documentation of the investment. This will be wire transfers, wire transfer statements, bank statements proving that the investment was made. Also receipts, and again, bank statements proving that in addition to wiring the money, capitalizing the company, that you've actually spent money, right? That you've actually bought the products you said you would buy, or the inventory, that you've leased the office space you told them in the business plan. Basically, documentation proving that, first of all, the company was capitalized the way you described, so basically the money was wired into this company, and two, that the money was used and spent in the way described in your business plan. In addition to that, you will have to bring your E2 visa business plan. That's critical. And all your basically immigration forms, copies of all the DS-156E, DS-160 form, as well as copies of your passports, etc. Right? So you want to make sure that you organize all the evidence neatly before your E2 visa interview, right? Like for all of our clients, we prepare this interview packet. But if you are not working with a lawyer or anyone assisting you, the most critical parts of the interview packet are going to be basically all the evidence proving the eligibility criteria. So proof of your citizenship, proof of ownership of the company, obviously proof that the company is actually in an existing business operating enterprise, proof of your substantial investment, and proof that that investment is not marginal. So documents proving all of this. Generally with E2 cases, the majority of these documents are the business plan, company formation documents proving your ownership, passports, right, proof of citizenship of the owners, and then finally all the financial bank statements, wire transfers, receipts, invoices proving that the investment was in fact made. And if you have U.S. employees, which really helps the case, also bringing a proof of payroll payments and wage statements, etc. for payroll. Now let's move on from the documents a bit onto what you can anticipate on the day of the interview and what I would do. And then after that, I'll go through some questions. And then after that, I will cover some tips and advice for the interview. So regarding the documents is the first thing. Prepare your documents, print them out, have them neatly prepared. In addition to the interview packet proving, also make sure you're bringing your U.S. passport, your interview notice, so that you can actually enter the embassy. But the number one thing you should do, right, before you even get to this interview, get a good night's rest, right? Prepare your documents and get a good night's rest. Because at the end of the day, you don't know how long it will take, how long you have to wait inside this consulate, how long you have to be there. And you want to be well rested so that when your time comes to actually do the interview and talk to the officer, that you actually are able to articulate everything properly. So I tell everyone, get a good night's rest. Then on the day of the interview, my advice is, eat breakfast, drink coffee if you normally do, follow your normal morning routine. I basically advise everyone to eat before you go to this interview, because although you may have an early morning or, early start date listed on your invitation, like your notice for the interview, you don't know how soon you will be called. So you may be waiting for a while inside the consulate, inside the embassy to be called for your interview. So my advice to everyone is, just make sure you eat so that you're not starving and in a bad mood while you're waiting for the officer to call you. In addition to that, make sure I tell everyone, look professional, right? Like you want to convince the U.S. government that you've started you made a substantial investment. You're starting a company, a business in the U.S. that will scale and grow. Well, in order to prove that and to give a good image and to look serious about it, I think first impressions matter. And if you look professional, if you dress nicely, that doesn't mean wear a suit and a tie, but just dress nicely in a professional manner so that the officer immediately upon looking on you will think that, hey, this is a serious business person and they're going to come here to the US to build a solid company that qualifies for the requirements. And then finally, on the day of the interview, make sure you're on time. Don't show up hours early because it's just going to cause anxiety, but also don't show up, just a minute before the interview date. I tell everyone, show up about half an hour before the time on the notice, so that you have time to, if they call you in, process security, all of that. And then finally, don't bring any electronics like laptops or anything like that. It's generally a pain to store those at consulate. And I tell everyone, don't wear a lot of metal and things that will cause issues as you're going through metal detectors and security, because you should anticipate security like at an airport to get inside the consulate. So Say you've done all this, you've gone through, security. Now you're waiting to be called to speak with the officer. How will that look, and what can you anticipate, and what questions can you anticipate? So each consulate's set up a little bit differently, but what you can anticipate is you'll be taken to an area where you will wait, and at some point the consular officer will call you. Now in some consulates you're sitting at like a desk, like a kiosk, talking to them, and others you're standing, but the bottom line is that you're going to be talking one-on-one with this officer. One thing that throws many people off, and I want to kind of highlight here, is people often anticipate, because this is a more serious interview, it's not a tourist visa or a student visa, that they're going to be in a separate room. And the reality is no. Like basically you may be standing next to someone who's just applying for a visitor visa, like a B1, B2 visa or a student visa, and you're going to be standing right there, and you're going to be discussing sort of very personal financial matters with this officer in earshot of others. It's just kind of how it is, unfortunately, and you should prepare for this and mentally be aware of it, because I know it throws many people off guard. So regarding the questions, let me go through some of the questions here. One piece of advice I have is, I think you should prepare for the questions 100%, but where I caution everyone is overly rehearsing answers, right? Now, obviously, to some extent, you want to go over them, you want to be able to answer, and you don't want to be caught off guard, because you do want to demonstrate that you qualify for this visa. But what I find is that you're going to prepare, if you're rehearsing answers verbatim, you're going to miss that the officer may not ask you exactly like that. They may ask you shorter questions or longer questions or follow-ups. So rather than just rehearsing verbatim answers, I would much rather you practice what you want to convey and understand what you're conveying, rather than rehearsing exact lines you're going to say. And basically the way to this, before I go into the questions themselves, is my number one advice for answering questions is understand your business plan and understand your investment. So basically understand how much money you've invested and what it was spent on. Understand what that money will allow the company to do. So how will it grow, and how will it lead to the hiring of US employees? If you can answer these things well, then I think you'll be able to answer all of the officer's questions, right? So now diving into the questions, right? So one line of questioning that the officers often employ is basically your background and your intentions with this E2 visa, right? So why do you want to obtain an E2 visa? What's your professional background and experience that will allow you to build out this US company? What motivated you to invest in this specific business? Now, one thing I want to caution you here with, many people use this E2 business as a career change, right? They're investing in things they don't have experience with. Don't worry about that. And I think you should still be able to articulate why you chose this business, why you're investing in it, and how your previous experience will help you to scale this company. I don't want you to be worried if this is your first time venturing into this industry. I would say at least 50% of my E2 visas that I've worked on over the years are career changes or completely different lines of businesses than what the individual was doing in their home country. And that is perfectly fine. But you should anticipate that you may get questions about this. The next line of questioning here will have to do with, like I previously said, the investment and the financial details. And the documents will prove this, but the officer will almost guaranteed want to verify these. And this has to do with, hey, how much money have you invested? What was that money spent on? What are you planning on spending more money on, right? How much operating cash flow do you have based on that initial investment? And tied into this, basically, the hiring of U.S. workers, right? So do you plan to hire U.S. workers? If not, when do you plan to do so? And similarly, what other expenses are upcoming? Like, will you be renting an office? Have you already rented an office? What about other office space? What about contractors? And this is basically what I said, initially, is the understanding of the business plan and the money that was spent in the investment that was made. This is the main line of questioning, and the officers generally have a lot of questions here because this is what they use to understand whether or not you qualify for this investor visa. So another line of questioning has to do with the business operations. So basically, sometimes the officers are very curious and become more curious, right, about the business itself. And one of the reasons for that is that they have to ascertain whether this will be what's called a non-marginal business, basically a business that can scale to the point where it's going to provide a living for Americans and not just you, right, for others than you and your family. So to do that, they often want to understand the business and how it's going to operate and scale. So here you can anticipate questions about, target customers, target revenue numbers, and sort of operations. What are you exactly selling? How are you going to reach your target audience, etc. And this goes back to what I said, just know your business plan inside and out and be able to articulate how this business will operate and how will it scale. Another line of questioning will have to do with you, the investor, and your role, right? Because the treaty investor is coming to the US and is issued a visa to direct and develop the enterprise, right? So here the bottom line is, and the officers want to make sure that you will be able to direct and develop the enterprise. So they will want to see, hey, are you keeping your job abroad, or is this going to be your full-time job? Do you have management experience? If not, how do you plan on doing this, right? And don't be worried if you don't. Like I've said, I've done many E2 visas for people for whom this is a career change. But you should be aware that this visa is issued for you to come to direct and develop this U.S. company. So you may receive questions about your role and exactly how you're going to be managing and directing this enterprise. And then I already mentioned this previously when discussing, the finances, but you will likely receive questions about employment of U.S. workers and just basically the employment of Americans and how you plan to achieve that. And generally the questions go from, have you already done so? Are you already employing, U.S. workers? If yes, that really helps the case. If not, how soon do you plan to employ U.S. workers? And, sort of what is the growth trajectory here where you will be hiring more U.S. workers? Now, a couple of things, right? So this isn't an exclusive list of questions, right? There's other questions the officer may ask, but most of them will have to do with your business plan and your background and the investment, right? But these are the most common ones I see. One thing I want to caution you about is that sometimes the interviews are very short and the officers don't ask a lot of questions. The reason for that is that the officers review these applications, and often they review them, they ask for additional documents before the interview, and then when you get to the interview, the officer doesn't have that much to ask because they've already clarified most of these questions, right? Don't be alarmed by that, right? But just be aware that in some cases, there's not as many questions as I've outlined in this video. Now, in addition to questions, I want to go through a couple of just tips and advice on, sort of answering these questions and what to do, not do during this interview. First and foremost, be honest. I can't stress this enough. Officers are First and foremost, they're trained on picking up if someone is, being nervous or not really telling the truth. But most importantly, if you, misrepresent anything, if you lie to the U.S. government, you may be banned from this country forever. So there's absolutely no reason to be dishonest about anything. I say this to all my clients. Every case has negative parts and strong parts. The strong parts need to be highlighted. Negative parts need to be explained. That's completely normal. But from your end, you should be honest 100%. Always say the truth during this interview. Similarly, stay calm. If you look overly anxious and are so worried, the officer will pick up on it. And I tell everyone, there's nothing to be worried about, right? The bottom line is the absolute worst case thing that can happen is that the officer says they're not willing to issue this visa on this day, at which point you should ask, okay, but what can I do, officer? Because I've invested all this money. These are my dreams. I've really done a lot, to be able to get this visa. So what can I do to strengthen my case? And anytime this has happened to any of my clients, except one case that I can remember, the client actually follows these steps and resubmits that evidence and then goes back to the interview and is issued a visa, or sometimes the visa is issued just after sending in some documents. So the bottom line is there's no point to be overly stressed and worried and be overly anxious because you're not doing anything wrong. So my second piece of advice is just to remain very calm during this interview. Now, the next thing here, and this is probably hard to do if you're not used to this setting, but it's Provide clear and concise, basically straight to the point answers. The officer doesn't have a lot of time. They have a lot of cases to go through. You're there to, answer clarification questions. So generally speaking, as you're going through the answers in your head and as you're speaking to the officer, try to get to the point, right? Now, if you need to add some color, some context to explain, an answer to a question, that's completely reasonable. But the officer doesn't need to know additional details, right? If they're asking you how much money have you invested, you can just tell them the figure, right? You don't have to explain a bunch of details about the investment. And that way you will allow the officer to kind of process the case faster. And oftentimes officers will cut you off actually and make you, get to the point because again, they're under time pressure and they want to make sure that they're collecting the information they need, but that they're not spending additional time that they do not want to invest in this interview. Now, my next tip for everyone is, and I've kind of said this over and over, but I want to say it again, just know your numbers in and out, right? Know how much you've invested, know how much you've spent, know how much your targeted, projected growth numbers are, annual revenue numbers, et cetera, know those, right? If you know your numbers, you're going to come off as prepared, as someone who's actually put in a lot of thought into this. If you can't answer simple questions about numbers as an investor into a company, you will simply not come off as someone who is, professional and well invested in this endeavor. The next point, which I've also made here, and the next tip is just know your business in and out, right? And this goes a bit to the numbers, but it also goes to operation. It goes to customer acquisition, to the price of your goods, your services. Understand what you're selling, how much it costs, how you're going to get clients. Be ready to answer those questions and just know it in and out. And similarly, know your, U.S. worker hiring strategy in and out, because that's where the questions will mainly come in. Then a couple of just common sense tips, right? But be on time, look professional, and be extremely respectful, right? So basically, these officers, right? Like I said, they're law enforcement officers to some extent here, right? They're consular officers. They may be not particularly bubbly or friendly or polite. Don't lose your cool. Always maintain professional demeanor. I tell everyone, look professional, act professional, and be respectful to the officer. The officer is the key to receiving an E2 visa. So there's never a point, right, to disrespect an officer or act rude and during this interview. It will never make sense, and just don't do that because it can hurt your case. And then finally, another common sense, tip, again, just be on time. I'm always surprised when people say they showed up late and they were so stressed and they forgot this, they forgot that. I tell everyone the preparation for this interview starts the day or maybe even the week before, right? So that you're prepared to go and do this interview. Don't be late. Don't, forget things. Just be well prepared, right? And then finally, this is my final point here, my final tip for everyone, right? At the end of the interview, there's one question that you absolutely have to ask, which is, what's next? Like, did I get the visa? If so, what does that mean? Am I leaving my passport here? Are you going to mail me the visa? Am I picking it up? If the answer is no, that they're not issuing the visa, you have to ask why and what you can do. I mean, you've just invested a bunch of money into a U.S. company. This is a major endeavor. You want to, move to the United States to direct and, run this company. If you're told no, you have to ask why and how you can correct this. You shouldn't just abandon this venture because the officer, doesn't think you immediately meet the criteria. And you have to look at this a little bit from the other side, where the officer's job is to make sure they're only issuing visas to people who definitely meet this criteria, right? So if there's any doubt, the goal isn't to, give up. The goal is to just clear all that doubt and make the officer be able to issue you that visa. So bottom line is, at the end of the interview, you have to ask, how did I do? What can I expect? If the answer is I'm not getting the visa, why? And what can I do to receive it? And basically have an understanding of what the next steps are after this interview. Most importantly, to wrap up this video, I tell everyone you should view this as an exciting moment. This is the final step before the visa can be issued. You should use this as a opportunity to demonstrate that you qualify for this E2 visa, and you should be excited about it. If you have any questions, post them in the comments. I'll do my best to record more videos. And if you like the content, and if if these videos are helpful, please hit the like button, follow the channel. That really helps me. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.